Hi everybody, today is Monday, December 16th, and Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. Thank you.
Colonel, let's start with what's happening right now in Syria. We've learned that Israeli airstrikes on the western part of on the western coast of occupied Syria early this morning triggered an earthquake measuring 3.2 on the Richter scale. And we've seen this type of attack during this week, the last week, that they're just destroying everything in Syria. What are the concerns coming from Syria, and what's happening in the mindset of Israelis right now, in your opinion? Because we were talking about that Israel and the United States, together with Turkey, are happy with the situation. But what is the necessity of these attacks?
Well, I think we have to understand properly what happened. First of all, the issue we tend in our media to focus on the toppling of Bashar al-Assad, which is which has happened definitely. But the problem for Israel is not Bashar al-Assad. The problem for Israel was to have a large neighbor, an organized neighbor. And we have probably to understand that, to remember that during the Cold War, Israel was surrounded by Lebanon, which is not really a threat per se. It became a threat as Palestinians went there to seek refuge. But otherwise, they had large enemies. Syria is one, Jordan is another one, and Egypt, notably, another one. And remember that in 1948, those countries attacked Israel. They attacked Israel because Israel didn't respect the substance and the letter of the resolution 181 of November 1947. But nevertheless, these were enemies, and Israel has always considered that having those large enemies was part of a, let's say, permanent threat on their country. That's why they tried to how to say that, to fraction these countries. The problem with Egypt and Jordan was solved because of the US influence, and the US in fact managed to sponsor peace agreement between Jordan and Egypt, Israel, of course, and Egypt. The thing is that these countries, especially after the 1979 73 war, were not keen to resume fighting. They had domestic problems, domestic issue. They tried to develop their own economy, and they had. I mean, if you look at Egypt, it's a huge country with a huge population, especially in the north, with huge social issues and all that. So they had to concentrate on other aspects than just making war with Israel. So once they recovered the Sinai, the problem was more or less solved, and you have a peace agreement. Jordan is a different issue because here you had the king of Jordan, the father of the current, I don't remember his name right now. He was married with had an American wife, and relationship between the Kingdom of Jordan and the U.S. has always
King
been
Abdullah,
quite
if I'm
easy.
not
Sorry,
mistaken. King
sorry.
Abdullah. King Abdullah.
King Abdullah is the current one. That was King Hussein.
King
That was
Hassan.
King Hussein at the time, and the relationship with US were always quite good. And Jordan is not a heavily armed country. It's not very much considered as a threat against Israel, so it was not an issue. But Syria be has always been considered as a threat by Israel. The the country is a huge country, I mean, much bigger than Israel, with a very powerful ally, which used to be the Soviet Union. And for that reason, Israel has always been extremely careful with, not careful with Syria, but also feared that Syria could become a threat. And that's the reason why the Israelis kept the Golan Heights as an occupied territory, because for them it was a key element, a key region to monitor with intelligence gathering issues on the Mount Hernon area that they just extended a few in the last week. Just extended this area, but from the heights of the Golan, they could monitor almost all Syria and the southern part of Lebanon. So for them, it was very important. And recently, the Minister of Defense of Israel and chief of staff of the IDF said that if ranking the threats against Israel, they considered that the major threat to Israel was Syria, and then Iran, and the last of the list, which counted, I don't remember if it was 7 or 10 possible threats. The last one was ISIL or ISIS, depending on you see it. So for Israel, Islamists were not a threat. Syria has always been considered as a major threat, the closest, the largest, and the most organized. And for that reason, they struggled a lot to dismantle Syria, and that was, in essence, the rationale behind the Yinon plan. The Yinon plan was a plan that was drawn in the late 80s by a former colonel of the Israeli army. And that's basically a plan, an idea to balkanize Syria and to create different sub countries with Syria. And this plan was used in Yinon was an advisor to Netanyahu at the time. This plan became the centerpiece of a document that was published in the late 90s. I think it was 1996 or something like that, which was entitled A Clean Break, that was proposed by a US think tank, and that took over more or less the idea of Yinon. And we could see the same plan taken by the US in 2012. You may remember, I don't know if I mentioned that in your program or in another program, but you had in August 2012, there was a document that has been leaked, and probably I can show you that document. Opla, sorry. Now I have to find it back. Sorry about that. This was a document that explained, it was produced by the DIA, and it explained a way to balkanize Syria. And, where is it? No, it's here. Sorry. Here we go. Sorry, it's in French, but this document, and it was, sorry for that. I have to, sorry. Sorry. I had the text in English, and because it's very telling what the US and the Israelis wanted to do in that particular region. Here it is. There we go. I don't know if you can read that, but first of all, so that's the date of the document is the 5th of August, 2012, and it said very clearly the Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Al Qaeda in Iraq are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. So it's important to remember that the insurgency in Syria was not a popular insurgency. It was definitely an insurgency driven by the outside, and namely, the Muslim Brotherhood was based in Turkey. The Salafists, that were people coming from, as well as Al Qaeda in Iraq, these were people that were expelled or pushed by the Americans from Iraq into Syria. And then you have the second aspect, which is very interesting. In this paragraph, and that's the text of the actual text of the report of the DIA. If the situation unravels, there is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria, in the region of Hasaka and Deir el-Zor. And this is exactly what the supporting powers, Western powers, to the opposition want, in order to isolate the Syrian regime, which is considered the strategic depth of the Shia expansion, Iraq and Iran. So, meaning that it was an idea that, in fact, follows the pattern developed by Yenon to divide Syria into a Kurdish area in the northeast of the country, a Salafist uh, uh, principality, if I take the actual word used by DIA, a Salafist principality in the south part of Syria, and a Shiite part, if you want, in the northwest of the country, namely what you have today with Aleppo, Latakia, Tartus, and so on. So this was a plan, in fact, and that plan was, let's say, designed well before the uprising or the insurgency of 2012. Let me just remind you that in February 2012, the Russians, in collaboration with the Syrian government, agreed to remove or to have Bashar al-Assad removed from power peacefully. And this initiative was presented to the Western power. The initiative was supported by Marty Atisari, who used to be Nobel Prize. He was recently designed as a Nobel Prize for peace. But the Western powers refused. So the problem was not Bashar al-Assad, because if Bashar al-Assad would have been removed peacefully, politically replaced, then that would have removed any reason to continue this insurgency in Syria. And the purpose of the insurgency was not to remove Bashar al-Assad. The purpose of the insurgency was to divide Syria. That's what, in fact, what has been achieved by the Turks and probably the Turks didn't want exactly that, because if you look, that's the map. Oh, sorry. I will show you. This is the map. This is the map today of Syria. So you have in yellow, you have the Kurdish area. In green, you have the area that is under control, total or partial, by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. You have the tiny dots, red dots here in Tartus and Latakia, which are still the areas where you have the Russians. And if you go here, of course, here the map, we should be able to zoom into it. But in fact, you have in blue, you have the occupied Golan, and you have this small extension here. That's the territory that was taken over by Israel in the last week. So that's a little bit the situation, and you see that we are not very far away from what the DIA had in mind in August 2012, and this has been possible precisely because the rationale for the insurgency was the presence of Bashar al-Assad. And removing Bashar al-Assad peacefully in 2012 would have removed this opportunity. And for that reason, the Western powers refused to have him peacefully removed. And that's a very interesting point. But the key aspect here to remember or to keep from that is that what Israel wanted is a divided Syria. And now the Kurdish area is more or less under the control of the US. The green slash Hayat al Tahrir area is more or less under control of Turkey. And there is still this Russian presence, which, by the way, apparently, I mean, the Russian would like to leave because they don't see any point to keep a force or a base or whatever structures in Syria today. But apparently, both Turkey and the Hayat al-Sham would like the Russian to stay. That's quite counterintuitive. But my view is that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is probably now an idea of developing, or let's say trying to create something in the area it has under the control to establish new administration and things like this. I don't know, but I suspect this is that. I mean, what we have seen the recent day point towards in that direction. But even though Israel supported and even trained and even armed HTS for this operation, I'm not sure HTS is, let's say, or I should formulate that differently. HTS probably think that this holy alliance with Israel will be short-lived. And the reason why they think that is that in the first days, and in fact during the HTS operation, Israel started to bomb the older position of the depot, munition depot, and armament depots and tanks and everything that belonged to the former Syrian Arab army, even though the Syrian Arab army didn't use those equipment against HTS. But I would say Israel destroyed that preventively, meaning that Israel has absolutely no trust in HTS. And probably HTS understands that and understands that it was an alliance of circumstances just for this case, but this will not be an alliance for the long term. Israel will not keep this alliance as an alliance. And as soon as Syria has been divided and all that, probably Israel will continue to step up with his presence in the southern part of Syria. And in fact, they have already started to take over some territory, to expand beyond the occupied Golan, bypassing, by the way, the neutral zone that was I wouldn't say guarded or protected, but I would say monitored. It's probably a better word, monitored by UN forces. And Israel apparently has already plan set to step up the population, Israeli population or Israeli occupation of those occupied territories. So there are already plans to move Israeli into this area. So we see here again that any, let's say, alliance with Israel is always marked with a lot of question marks, especially for the long term. Israel will never, I underline twice, will never hold with an alliance if it's against its objective. They will not even negotiate. They will just attack their former allies. And that has always been like this in the past, and it will be so in the future. And I think everybody understands that. We have to remember that the name of the head of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and namely al-Jolani, this is the Arabic pronunciation of his name, Jolani. But if you pronounce it in the way it's pronounced in the region, you would say al-Golani. And al-Golani means that he comes from the Golan area. So how can you imagine that this guy coming from the Golan originally, that wants to develop a Syria with a whole its own territory? How long will that last until Golani will reclaim the Syrian authority on the Golan? And in fact, we had a couple of days ago, I saw a report that the new authorities of Syria sent a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations to ask the UN and the international community to force Israel to get out of the Golan area. So we see that these alliances are extremely fluid, that Israel, and remember that a few days ago, I don't know if I mentioned that on your program, but a few weeks ago, um, Bezalel Smotrich said that the area until Damascus are part of Israel. So we see here that you have on one side the Syrian claiming the right to recover the authority on the Golan, and on the other hand, you have the Israeli based on religious on religious belief, because this is just based on religion. In fact, they feel that Syria, and a large part of Syria, in fact, should be part of the greater Israel. So here we see that this is almost an impossible alliance between the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Israel. And therefore, there will be a point, I don't know when exactly, that that would require a crystal ball that I don't have so far, but there will be a point in which this alliance that was possible, that made possible the invasion of Syria, this alliance is designed to break. It might hold with Turkey, because Turkey has not really ambitions towards Syria as such, even if there is probably some kind of old Ottoman, let's say, reminiscent aspect in the operation. But I think Turkey has a more immediate problem, which is the Kurds. And I have read a report recently that Erdogan has requested the departure of the PKK and the Kurds, namely, from the eastern part of Syria. So, meaning that we see Turkey with a problem which is definitely related to the Kurds. And that's probably also what Erdogan wanted to discuss with Bashar al Assad recently. You probably I mentioned on your channel that on several occasions in the last years, Erdogan wanted to open a dialogue with Bashar al Assad. And this year, that was definitely in July and in November, or October. Erdogan asked Bashar al Assad for a meeting, and Bashar al Assad refused because he didn't want to talk to a leader that was occupying a part of the Syrian territory. Uh, I'm not here to judge or probably other consideration. I have no idea. My view is that it was a mistake from Bashar al-Assad, because most probably what Erdogan wanted was not to take over Syria, but probably to coordinate action against the Kurdish occupation in the western part, the eastern part of the country. And that was probably the purpose of Erdogan, the meeting Erdogan wanted to set. I don't know exactly, but I think that's probably what Erdogan wanted. But now the situation is so that you don't have Bashar al-Assad anymore. The concern of Erdogan will remain the Kurds, and now he has almost uh, free, free, open cards to attack the Kurds, even if it creates tensions with the U.S., because the U.S. are in fact sponsoring this Kurdish state in eastern Syria. But I would say, or would suggest, that the main concern of Erdogan is the border area. I mean, the northern border of Syria and the southern border of Turkey, and that's probably the area that Erdogan wants to secure, and where he probably wants to have all Kurds to be expelled from. The HTS is different because they want to create a new state. We will see under which condition. What is this group still an Islamist movement with all the what we tend to liken Hayat Tahrir al-Sham with ISIS, the Islamic State. I mean, it was certainly in the genesis of the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. ISIS played a role, definitely. The Western powers supported the development of the ISIL in the western part of Syria. It tried to prevent the expansion of the ISIS in the Kurdish territory, but it never made any problem to the development of ISIL in the western part of Syria. And that's why basically you had Russia to step in the conflict in September 2015. And by the way, this issue was perfectly explained by John Kerry, who explained perfectly that the Western powers observed the progression of the Islamic State in the western part of Syria, but they didn't do anything because they considered that it was an opportunity to topple Bashar al-Assad. And but on the other hand, for what regards the Kurdish area, then the Western powers tried to, let's say, channel the development of the ISIL, but never really prevented it. And the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was, as I explained, I think last time, could grow with the help of the French, the Americans, the Turks, and the probably the Germans in this area, this de-escalation area or de-escalation zone in Idlib under the protection of Turkey. So, but this Hayat al-Sham wants to develop a new state. Again, we'll see how this state develops. And and here, yes, we are then at this point. We don't know exactly what they want. We certainly can identify the need for the new authorities of Syria to restore the borders of Syria and probably to request the departure of Israeli forces. I'm not sure that the international community will do anything against Israel and Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights. They have never done anything in that direction, and they didn't even prevent Trump to recognize the annexation of Golan by Israel. So I think we shouldn't expect much from the international community, and that's where we are. So, in my view, we are not in a more stable situation today. I think the situation is more unstable as ever because, again, we don't know exactly what the different stakeholders want to do. We see an Israel which is defeated in the South Lebanon, has been, we can clearly say, defeated in Gaza, despite all the destruction and all that. It's a country that has definitely lost the respect of the international community. It's a country that has lost even territories along the northern border, its northern border. So you have all the condition for Israel to find some kind of escape to the situation in which they are. It is, and therefore there is an opportunity for Israel to escalate the situation, to expand its territory, to have some kind of victory. The victory they didn't have in Gaza, that they don't have in the West Bank, that they didn't have in the southern Lebanon. They're probably seeking this victory in the Golan area. So we are in a more dangerous situation than we were, let's say, a couple of months ago. But this shows also how the two conflicts, the Ukrainian conflict on one hand and the Palestinian conflict on the other one, has radically changed the relationships and the let's say the geopolitical environment, both in the near Middle East and in the Central Europe. So that's a little bit where we are today. So
Yeah.
a lot of questions.
Yeah. Colonel, right now, when you see the way that Iranians and Russians are talking about what has happened in Syria, they both are agreeing on that the situation was not the way that they could save Bashar al-Assad. And that's why they have decided to withdraw from Syria. And do you think that this move on the part of Russians and Iranians was a strategic move or a catastrophic defeat?
No, well, the result is that for both countries, it's a loss. I mean, definitely, Iran has lost its corridor between this ground bridge, terrestrial bridge between the Iranian border to Lebanon, and but in fact, it is in the same situation as it was prior to 2003, prior to the invasion of Iraq. So the break of the bridge happened in Iraq at the time. Today, it's in Syria. But definitely, it's a loss because it was very convenient to have, and I think even they even both build. Sorry, I mix German and English sometimes. Um, they built a highway that link is Iran to Lebanon. So that was kind of a strategic road that helped. That was kind of lifeline for Syria, for the southern part of Syria, and all that. So this this was important for Iran. Um, from the Russian side, they had with Syria, they had a very strong ally. I mean, it used to be a strong ally, but they had an ally on the Mediterranean Sea, and this ally has started to be weakened uh, since 2011. And today, of course, they still have those two bases in Tartus and Khmeinim in the neighborhood of Latakia. Um, and these are still strongholds of the Russians along the Mediterranean Sea. And they still have those bases so far, by the way. They lost the political eye that was Bashar Assad. But we can see that from another aspect, because at the end of the day, Syria, especially since 2011, was an ally, and Russia tried to treat Syria as an ally. But on the other hand, it was a burden at the same time. Because, I mean, today probably the situation would be a little bit different because Syria has rejoined the Islamic community, the different fora of the Islamic community and the Arabic community. Therefore, today the situation is probably a little bit different. But for years, Syria was excluded from this area, and therefore having Syria being the ally of Syria was a kind of political burden for Russia. It complicated the relationships between Russia and Saudi Arabia, or the different kingdoms that you have, UAE and Qatar and things like that. Now, by having this ally that disappeared, it's probably lighter for Russia to develop relationship with those Arab states without the burden of having this Shia state, if I can express it that way. Although at the same time, you could say that Russia could be the bridge between the Shiite community and the Sunni community, if I put it in religious terms. Today, obviously, we don't have that. Today, we have a more appeased situation between the Sunni world and the Shiite world. We have seen that with the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the mood is different. Therefore, the loss of the of Syria as enemy, as an ally of Russia, is has probably a more neutral effect today. So it's a loss. Factually, it's a loss, but it has probably not so much implications, or less implication that we may expect. It probably strengthened the bond or the relationship between Russia and the rest of the Arab world. So, and we have to see how the relationship with Tahrir al-Sham and Russia will develop. We know that Turkey apparently doesn't want to harm its relationship with Russia. And that's probably the reason why Turkey didn't ask Russia to remove the bases or to leave the places in Tartus and Khmeimim. So um, Turkey has always had a very special, let's say, behavior, but also special role in the region as the crossroads between the Eastern world, the Asian world, and the Western world, between Islam and a Christian world, between, let's say, the eastern part of the Mediterranean and the western part of the Mediterranean. This has always been a very particular place. And even in NATO, I experienced relationship with the Turks quite extensively, and I saw how the Turks were behaving also very differently from the others. I mean, most countries in NATO. I mean, within NATO, as I worked 5 years in within NATO, the most countries are extremely obedient towards the US. Well, Turkey is a country that always dared to raise its voice and say, no, we don't want that. This is not, and they are extremely procedural. So when the US tried to do something, you had suddenly the Turks saying, well, that's not exactly what is in this charter or in this procedure and all that. I want you to modify this. And so they were quite a very tough negotiator in the meetings with Turkey. That's where all the NATO members were. So very interesting country from that aspect, because they really dared to say no to the US. And remember that even as the US wanted to invade Iraq in 2003, you had, of course, the very brilliant opposition of France and Philippe de Villepin in the Security Council of the UN Security Council, making big declaration and all that. You had this, but you also had another country that opposed very firmly against this invasion. That was Turkey, because Turkey understood that by invading Iraq, this would change the balance in the very fragile setting of all the tribes and nationalities and ethnicities in the region. And in fact, that's exactly what happened, because by making an Iraq that is now returned to ethnic rule somehow, and providing specific territory, autonomous territory, even to the Kurds in the north of Iraq, and all that. This changed a lot of relationships between the communities in this part of Northern Europe, eastern part of Turkey, and affected the inside of country, the domestic issues in Turkey itself. So Turkey has identified the problem much earlier than the Western powers did, and for that reason, the Turks have kept some kind of anger at the US, because the US came here for no reason, in fact, to disturb this fragile balance that existed in the region. And in fact, everything that happened since then is a result of this change of this fragile balance. I mean, all the terrorism we had, ISIL and everything, all that is the product of the US intervention in 2003. So that's why this intervention and all those who participate to that, in my view, should be prosecuted, because it's not just for all the human lives that were lost, it's also because they destabilized completely the region. Because all of them, including those so called generals, didn't anticipate, because they didn't know the real condition of the situation on the ground. They never understood it. Never. None of them. Despite brilliant declaration of generals like Petraeus and things like this, he never understood the realities on the ground. He tried to understand, but he never managed to understand. And the result of that is that everything has been disturbed, and everything, in fact, what we have witnessed in the last couple of weeks is a byproduct of the US intervention in Iraq in 2003, because that's this intervention that created Islamism. And in fact, all the terrorism, Islamist terrorism we have got in Europe since then, since 2001, or yes, 2000, yeah, let's say 2001, is the result of the US policy in the Middle East. We can say even further, because in fact, the deepest roots of Islamist terrorism can be traced back to 1991, when in fact the US maintained its occupation of the northern part of Saudi Arabia. And that's the very fundamental starting point of all the Islamist terrorists we got since then. And that's why Osama bin Laden emerged, in fact. In fact, his first action was asking the US to leave the holy territory of Saudi Arabia. And there were much discussions in the Saudi government at the time to allow the US to stay there, especially after the defeat of Iraq. They agreed to have the US forces to prepare the offensive against Iraq, because at that time Saudi Arabia felt threatened by Iraq, which in fact was false. Iraq never threatened Saudi Arabia, but that was the perception at the time, and that's the rationale for allowing the US to prepare for the operation against Iraq. And then after the defeat of Iraq, this was the time when the Saudis asked the US to leave the country, and the US refused. And that's exactly the point where terrorism started. And in fact, it started with Islamist attacks against US forces in Saudi Arabia, in the base of Dhahran, notably. And then, because the US refused to leave the country, that in fact created an incentive for other Islamists to join the fight against the US. And that led, I mean, you had several attacks that led to the bombing of the embassies, US embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam on the 9th of August, 1998. And the response to that was heavy bombing with cruise missiles from the US against Afghanistan and against Sudan. And these two countries were not involved in any matter in all that. But that was the reply of the US. And because they assumed that those terrorists came from Afghanistan and from Sudan, because these were the two Islamist countries. But there was absolutely no evidence of that. And because of this unjust response of the US, which in fact was, and I remember because I lived in New York at that time, and at that time, Bill Clinton was involved in this famous Lewinsky affair. It was a kind of a sex scandal in the White House. And in order to, let's say, distract the media, he launched these attacks, these bombings. And this is interesting because I remember perfectly that at that time, Louis Free, who used to be the head of the FBI at the time, he said that those bombing were a very bad idea because this will cost a lot of terrorism and US victims in the future. And he was right because the 9/11, the 11th of September 2001, was in fact a replica of these bombings with aircraft or airplanes or airliners used as cruise missiles against the two towers. It was a very symbolic response, but it was engineered by young engineers, by the way, because all those 20 or 19 guys, or let's say some say 20, um, that designed or planned this 9/11 were in fact all engineers, and they made kind of a replica of the bombing of 1998. It was the bombing on 1988 happened just a few days after the bombing in Nairobi. That was on the 20th of August, 1998. And 3 years later, these guys made this replica, and that launched the whole a global war on terror and things like this. But it's interesting to see that everything, in fact, the initial Big Bang, if you want, was in fact the behavior of the US in the Middle East. Because you had people who had absolutely not the slightest understanding of the situation on the ground. And they never managed to have a real understanding of that. And I remember when I was in Afghanistan, I was talking to some people from the, the civil societies. So that was some journalists, I mean, Afghan journalists. And they explained me the situation about Afghanistan. And at one point they say, well, we will not pardon the British. No, they said we can pardon the Americans for what they have done in Afghanistan because they never understand. They are idiots and they never understand anything. But we cannot pardon the British because they know us. And that's obviously kind of a joke, but it illustrates the extremely thin understanding that the West and especially the US had prior to enter the Middle East. They were absolutely not familiar with the subtle type of understanding of the situation. And in fact, in my view, they should be accountable for what they have done because they managed a war without understanding anything. And they still don't, by the way. They tried to do so, and you have a lot of people. I mean, you can read on different think tanks and all that. Problem is that they don't manage, and a lot of those think tanks are very, let's say, strong ties with Israel somehow, cultural, I would say, meaning that there's absolutely no understanding of the mentality. And you have, in fact, that replicates very much what we have seen in Israel towards the Palestinians. The Israelis never managed to understand the mindset of the Palestinians. And that's the reason why we have those conflicts that are perpetuated by by inconsistencies, inability to plan or to design sophisticated or let's say adapted strategies to cope with the problem. We are absolutely incapable to adjust a strategy to fight an adversary whose logic cannot be understood. And that's the first thing to do at war is first to understand the logic of your enemy. And that's we see that, and that's why I wrote this book on the art of war, the Russian art of war. And that's also why I wrote the other one on the defeating the jihadist terrorism, to explain these different logics. Because once you understand the logic, then you can elaborate a strategy. But elaborating a strategy without understanding your enemy is just the key to failure, and that's exactly what we have seen. So we have just an expansion of the problem rather than a solution of the problem. And we have probably exactly the situation that we have today in Syria. I'm not sure we are closer to a solution. Of course, when you start to demonize someone and say that as Bashar al-Assad is the devil, is Hitler, and all that. But remember, Milosevic was designed as Hitler, and eventually he became exonerated from his crimes by the international court, the CPI, the ICC, sorry, the International Criminal
Mm.
Court. The same with Laurent Gbagbo, who used to be the president of the Ivory Coast, and he was also designed as a Hitler and all that. And eventually, he became acquitted by the International Criminal Court, meaning that we tend to demonize people in order to allow ourselves any kind of strategy against this country. The demonizing of these people is just a way to justify what normally should be unjustifiable. And with that, we destabilize country without understanding and without knowing how we will, what's next. And that's exactly what happened in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and everywhere. That's why you have in Afghanistan, you still have the Taliban. So you had 20 years of war, of killings, of Western soldiers killed, Afghan people killed for nothing, because today we are back to square one. So it's just illustration of this incapacity of the West to wage war. We're not even able to wage war. And we have a lot of soldiers with a lot of weaponry, and they have 20 guns and everything. When you see them, they are like a moving armory. But beyond that, they have absolutely no understanding of the enemy, and they are despite all the technology, radars and drones and machine guns and everything they have, they can still be defeated by Taliban with just Lee Enfield from the World War One, simply because the Taliban understand the Americans, or used to understand the Americans better than the Americans used to understand the Taliban. And we have exactly the same thing, and that's why we have exactly, I mean, we have discussed that several times when talking about Palestinians. It's exactly, the Palestinians know the Israeli better than the Israeli know the Palestinians. The Hezbollah knows the Israeli better than the Israeli knows the Hezbollah. That's why they are surprised every time they enter South Lebanon. They are surprised by what they found, because they don't know the enemy. And that's exactly the reason why we are in this kind of perpetual war. We have war conducted by incompetent militaries, people who are not up to their task, are totally unable to design battle plan, strategic plan, strategies. And if we go further, they are certainly totally unable to define an exit strategy. And we had a blatant example with um, with the U.S. leaving Afghanistan. I mean, there is no exit strategy. This is suddenly everybody runs runs away. Period. So this is not the this is not the way to wage war, and because we are precisely incapable of doing that. So this is a matter of concern, by the way, and we see exactly the same thing in at a different scale with Ukraine. That nobody was able to anticipate what happened. You had all these militaries coming with misinformation in the best case and disinformation in the worst case, but convinced of a reality that was completely different than the actual reality on the ground. As a result, they lose. And this is again my job is used to be intelligence, and the the purpose of intelligence is to understand your adversary. That's the essence of the game. It's not covert killing, clandestine action, or covert spying or whatever. The essence of intelligence is understanding your adversary. That's the essence. And that's exactly where everybody fails. And that's why we lose war.
Kamal, we had a situation in Syria which was a huge disagreement between Iran and Turkey so far. And right now, it seems to me that all the burden which were on the shoulders of Iran right now is going to be transferred on the shoulders of Turkey. Because whatever happens in Gaza, in Palestine, in the West Bank, right now, Turkey has a crucial role because of the leverage they're having in Syria and the leverage they're having toward Israel because of the oil coming from Azerbaijan goes through Turkey to Israel. They have this power of helping Palestinians and Gazans. Recently, as you've mentioned, because of that rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, we had some sort of better relationship between Shia and Sunni. Don't you think that in a long run, what has happened in Syria would improve even the situation for Gazans? Because Turkey, at the end of the day, had some sort of a very important disagreement with Iran in Syria. That's gone right now. And these people are totally connected with Turkey right now. And how do you see this
Well,
way?
yes, no, no, I think you're right. I mean, first of all, as I said, I think as I said that last time. Remember that Erdogan said a few weeks ago that he was ready to enter Israel, military. I mean, so we see that the situation in Israel apparently, if you look from far away, and you look what happened in the last day, you say, well, Israel has improved the situation. Is it really true? I'm not sure, because now it has someone at its border who has said that they are wanting to intervene. And they are these person, namely Erdogan, who said that he was ready to intervene in Israel, supports a movement that asks Israel to leave Golan because the head al Golani comes precisely for that region, and it doesn't to be considered as Israeli, to put it simply. And we have also to understand that when we see the way the West manage conflicts, you see, for instance, Ukraine. Russia is the bad guy, therefore we don't talk to anybody. We close all the door, we close all the windows, everything is closed, no talks, nothing, no diplomacy, zero. Finished. When you go in the Middle East, you don't have this kind of ideological position and think like this. It's even more fluid. As I very often say, the relationship, the friend of my friend is my friend. This sounds very logic for Western mind. But when you have an enemy, I think is almost impossible to solve for Western mind. I mean, the enemy of my enemy is my enemy doesn't work for a Western mind. But in the Middle East, this relationship may work because the relationships are not so uh, strongly defined as we tend to define them in the West. There's a lot more flexibility in the way we even if we are enemy, we are still able to talk to each other. And I experienced that myself because when I was in Sudan, I had to talk to different factions and rebels and try to accommodate to talk to them, try to make them to agree with each other and also with the government. And I saw there was a lot of flexibility and a lot of willingness on all parts, or readiness, better said. There was a readiness to talk to everybody because it's a society, it's a culture of negotiations, of bargaining. And when you bargain, you don't try to make prejudgment on your adversary. You come and you bargain, and you will see the relation develops. It will develops good or bad, but you keep talking. You keep trying to develop this relationship, and that makes the whole work of mediation, for instance, as I had to do in Northern Africa, very different from the way Western powers address conflict. And the interesting thing is that when I was in NATO, I was surprised to see that NATO sees war as just the use of military tools, period. It's the tank, the submarine, the aircraft, and that's war. But when you go in the Middle East, war is something much less bound to just weaponry. The politics, the relationships, all that works together. And you have, to some extent, something very similar with the Russians, although much better structured, and more bound to institutional, let's say, frameworks. But as opposed to the rest of the world sees war as a more holistic aspect. And what you can't win with weapons, you can win with words. What you cannot achieve with weapons, you can achieve that with words. So war is a moving dimension, is not something which is limited to the battlefield. And that's the reason why the Russians are able to talk to Erdogan, even if Erdogan delivers weapons or supply weapons to Ukraine. And the Russians will still be able to talk to Erdogan, even if Erdogan supported the group that toppled Bashar al-Assad. And you will have exactly the same thing from the other side. That's why, even though the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is designed as a terrorist organization, so I'm not challenging that, but we may find a different way from these countries, this movement, to address the situation in which they are now. They are in power, they are in charge, and for that reason, they may probably have another behavior. I don't know. I don't know if they will cut heads or things like that. I have absolutely no idea. I hope not, by the way, because apparently that was what was negotiated with Bashar al-Assad prior to the operation, apparently, according to the Russians. But in any case, we see that these cultures are more adaptive than the Western mentality. When we go somewhere, we come with our ideology, with our mindset, and we are almost unable to get out of this mindset. While in the rest of the world, you see that people can adapt very quickly to new situations. And we have seen that. You mentioned the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And Iran has pledged to support Palestinians. Turks have pledged to support Palestinians. Of course, Syria was an ally of Iran, but not really an ally of Turkey. But now they are, in fact, their common denominator is what they want to achieve with Palestinians. So, therefore, despite the fact that the Turks have toppled an ally of Iran, the Iran would cope with a new reality. The new reality is that Syria is gone. I mean, the Syria we knew is gone. So we have now to work with the new reality. We cannot live with the past reality or try to invent or reinvent the past reality. The today's reality is that Bashar is gone, and therefore it's a neighbor. Syria is there. They have common objectives. We may need each other for some, I don't know, trade or things like that. Therefore, there is no reason to cut all the ties, and they will adjust to that. So, something that I find sometimes with Western commentators, they tend to see the problems or the situation in the Middle East with the Western eyes, and we need to see them with the Middle Eastern eyes. And they are much more flexible, much more adaptable than we are. And therefore, they will adjust to the situation. That's the reason why we had, and that's for some, it was inconceivable to have Iran, a Shia country, supporting the Palestinian who are Sunni. But it happened. You know, so there are things that we see with our logic, with our mindset, that seems inconceivable according to us, but it's perfectly conceivable if you look at the mindset there. And and therefore I think that now we might, again, I have no crystal ball, and I cannot speculate on how things will evolve. But if we see an aggressive Israel against an entity that pledged to support the Palestinians, Israel will just worsen its situation. And the problem of Israel is exactly Israel, despite being there since 2000 years, Israel has never understood the mentality there. And they still have a Western mentality. I mean, all the leaders of Israel and most of its population, in fact, comes from Central Europe. There are Ashkenazi Jews who have a Western mentality. And in addition to the Western mentality, or probably part of the Western mentality, they have this kind of arrogance that establish that they are those who think right. All the rest of the world thinks wrong. The reality is that the rest of the world is precisely the rest of the world, and it's more powerful than what you are. So, therefore, you have to understand that you have a mindset, but they also have a mindset, and you have to take that into account. And that might be the mistake of the Israeli, especially when you have people as Smotrich, Ben Gvir, and Netanyahu who are strongly ideologically motivated and not really, they are not making decisions based on facts. They make decisions based on ideology, such as the decision of Smotrich, or the not the decision but the fact that he said that Damascus belongs to the greater Israel. I mean, this is ideology, this is nothing else, you know. And this is not the best way to win war. It's okay when you fight against a civilian population in Gaza, then you can achieve some kind of success by killing civilians, children and women. It's an easy win. But when it comes to fighting against people who have decided that their territory is their territory and not yours, then it's a different story. And we may be or come into this different story at one point. So I don't know. And if we see, because when we talk about Israel, of course we look at the military dimension. But now if you look at the political dimension of Israel, that has lost a lot of credibility in the world, that the even the Jewish people, in fact, has lost credibility, because and that explains the surge in anti-Semitism that we see everywhere, meaning that the the world, not just the rest of the world understands that Israel is not behaving properly. And that that may have implications. I mean, again, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know, and I hope it will not develop in something tragic. But my view is that we are slowly moving towards such a situation, and Israel is making absolutely no effort whatsoever trying to restore its image, trying to restore good relations with its neighbors, and tries to show that it is more, let's say, reliant on diplomacy than on the use of force. And slowly we see that the balance of force becomes more and more in unfavor, or becomes unfavorable to Israel. Of course, there is still the US behind them, and that's why they can afford to be so arrogant, and they can afford to their military operations against the neighbors. By the way, it's interesting to see that nobody condemned the invasion of Syria by Israel. Everybody screamed when Russia tried to protect the Russians from the Ukrainians in Donbass, and intervened in order to protect the population of Donbass. And the world, I mean the Western world, and then they sanctioned all those who didn't screamed with them. Um, but when Israel invades another country, including South Lebanon, by the way, you had absolutely no complaints by nobody. And even when, it's interesting, I try to compare the vocabulary used, but when the Hamas in 7th of October 2023 launched its operation, it was very quickly defined as a terrorist operation and a terrorist action, despite the fact that Israel is the occupying power of Gaza, that therefore Gaza or the Gazawi population or whatever Palestinian organization are in fact resisting an occupation. which occupation is illegal based on the decision of the International Court of Justice. So it's not something that I invented. This has been defined as illegal, and that concerns both West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But still, when these guys try to in charge and became tried to make this surprising in 7th of October, it was defined as a terrorist operation. But when a terrorist organization that has been recognized and registered by the US, by the European Union, by the UN, by, by several countries in the world as a terrorist organization, attacked the government of, of Syria, this was considered as a rebel attack. You see, so there's a kind of whitewashing of those people who worked with us, regardless whether they are terrorists or not. Um, so we see that we don't have, and that's also something that was revealed by both the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in Palestine. This is not just a double standard, but it's in fact the thing that we don't have any real value. We adjust the value to our interests, but we are not adjusting our interest on our values. That's exactly the main aspect, and that's exactly what is what's happened in Syria. Now the problem is that again, these guys who now have taken over Syria, they have their own objectives. And now the West, after helping them and supplying them and arming them and whatever, now they will have to face this guy. And I, I cannot exclude that the West will decide to intervene against those guys they supported. That may happen. I mean, if there is a clash with Israel, I can well imagine that some Western countries like UK, France, or US, I mean, always the usual suspects, that they will start an intervention in Syria because they are just bypassed by the guy they supported initially. So we are in a situation that is it's simply we reinvent the wheel every single day somehow. It's a loss of energy, of resources, of lives. It's just amazing. I mean, how things are managed. I mean, I don't really understand. I mean, if you look at the kind of leadership we have in the West, then of course you understand because the IQ of those guys are probably not much higher than the IQ of a shoebox. But in any case, uh, these are European leaders and or Western leaders, and they still um, have enough power to create problem in the rest of the world. So this is an interesting lesson. By the way, it's also interesting to say if we talk about the rest of the world, to see that the rest of the world, that may include BRICS and things like that, they are uh, they look at this conflict with a lot of distance. I mean, when you have a conflict in Ukraine, let's say, then very suddenly you have all the Europeans together. I mean, the leaders, mostly, probably not the population, but let's say the countries. Suddenly, it's a very um, unified answer. I mean, that is provided through NATO, through EU, through whatever, and they stick together or try to show a kind of unified picture. When you see the rest of the world, then you have a very different picture. I mean, not many countries engaged in favor of Syria, for instance, despite the fact that Syria had been reintegrated into the Islamic Cooperation Conference and this kind of fora. So and that's also something we have to take note of, is that the rest of the world is probably supportive to in the sense that they realize that Israel may not do well, or Turkey or US or whoever, but it will be very hard to unify them against, let's say, Israel or US or things like that. And that should also be part of the equation when we look at the situation, that it will be very hard to have a coalition. The West is very keen to make coalitions, but in the rest of the world, I'm not sure you will have coalitions, because they're not organized for that, first of all. There is no institutional uh, uh, context to have such kind of coalition, such as you may have, for instance, you had a coalition to go um, in in Afghanistan, for instance, under the flag of NATO or things like that. But you don't have that for the rest of the world, and that might be considered as a weakness, but it's also a strength, because again, the fact that you people don't stick together, that have distinct interests but still the ability to talk to each other, then it may explain why what I explained before about Syria, about Turkey and Iran about Palestinians, for instance. They will probably not be able to form a coalition, but they are able to talk and probably to coordinate some action and to go for the sake of the Palestinians. While if you wait for a coalition, and namely in the case of in the case of what happened in Palestine, if the West was consistent with its values and all that, the West should have made a coalition since years in order to somehow bring some peacekeepers in the occupied territories and try to develop here a Palestinian state. But nothing of the like will happen. So the West is strong when it's able to make coalition. When it's not able to make coalition, it's very weak. While the rest of the world will not be able to make big coalitions, probably, but it's able always to manage some kind of relationships and talks and coordination and things like that. And therefore, at the end of the day, in the long run, probably I have personally more trust in the ability of the Middle Eastern countries to solve the Israeli problem than the West to solve the Palestinian problem.
Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today. Great
That was
pleasure
my
as
pleasure.
always.
That was my pleasure. Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thank